All right, I'm going to review our exam on Wednesday, just kind of telling you some uh, where to look for some things and what to emphasize. Now, I've given you this written review, which is very good. I'm not going to give you this on every exam, but I'm going to go through each of these and kind of tell you where you can maybe find these things. Well, most of Chapter 1 you can find in the textbook or in the early videos, mostly in the textbook. But there are 5 unifying themes of life. That's textbook. These levels of organization, that's textbook. If you don't know what an emergent property is, think of it this way. Let's say I have a bunch of car parts. It's essentially a disassembled car. Now, if I bring those parts and I put them in a room, you can't go drive to the grocery store in that car because, well, it needs to be assembled. When I take those parts, arrange them just right, it has to be exactly right, and I put together and create a car that now has an emergent property. That is the ability to drive down the road to the grocery store. So that emergent property, being able to drive, only occurs when you place the parts in the right configuration in relationship to each other. And that's what happens in humans. We're just a bunch of chemicals. We have to arrange those chemicals in the proper order, how they're arranged, connected to each other, and create cells and things like that. And that's when life emerges, is when you put all of those things together. You get an emergent property, which we call life. Structures lead to function. So how you structure something is an important idea. In the case of us, lipids form membranes. Their structure, it's waterproof. And water, though, most things dissolve in water, or at least a lot of things dissolve in water. So if the water can't get through, then those chemicals that dissolve in water can't get through. And you can control what comes in and out of the cell by making this essentially waterproof shell around the cell in the form of the lipid bilayer, or what we commonly call a membrane. So kind of think of that. Think also maybe DNA. Its structure leads to its function, just like the lipids put together in the right order create a function. The DNA has a certain function, and by looking at its structure leads to it. Proteins, their structure leads to their function. We had protein folding, where the shape of the protein leads to its function. So look at all of those things and think about maybe how structure leads to function in at the very least, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. Water, though, and carbon also, we can think of that as their structure leads to their function. Carbon can make four covalent bonds, and giving it lots of extra chemical reactivity that most atoms cannot do. They can't do 4 covalent bonds, but the structure of carbon lets it do 4, and so that's why carbon is important. Same with water. It can do some chemistry things because of its shape, its structure, the stickiness, the fact that ice floats. All these different things occur because of the structure of water. Its structure leads to its function. So think about those things when I ask this question. And I usually ask something about the structure and function. Emergent properties are related to it. For structures, so what are you bound to find? You're bound to find a membrane. You're bound to find large DNA molecules. We call them chromosomes most of the time, even though that's really a slang word. When you talk about bacteria, we do call it a bacterial chromosome. You find ribosomes. What else do you find? I've given you 3 there. Other structures might be, for instance, the cytoplasm that everything sits in. You think of that as, you don't really think of that as a structure, but it certainly is. The cytoplasm is organized. So think of those as structures that you might find in a cell. There are other structures, such as organelles. All right, at least in eukaryotic cells, you would find those. So that would count. in all cells, the bacteria generally don't have organelles. They do have something called a vacuole, which is a sort of like an organelle, so you could probably include it. So maybe you could say vacuoles for the bacteria. Why is DNA important? I think I've gone over that. It's an information transmission either across organisms, as in when you reproduce, you have to duplicate your DNA, so that information is transferred to the next generation. That's one method. Another reason it's important is it stores the information for making the cell. For instance, making all the proteins in the cell, which do all of the work for maintaining and doing the things that that cell is going to do. All the chemical work is done by proteins, and DNA has the instructions for making those proteins. I'll leave that to the book on number 7, or videos if you want to go look up the structure of the DNA molecule. But you need to know things about like complementarity, which we've talked about in the lab. What else? The A's bond to T's, C's bond to G's, that sort of thing. All right, let's see, transcription and translation, lots of stuff out there. The lab helps with that. Ecological cycles are more in the book. Now, I did not go over the one on why there are no dragons. I probably won't ask this question, but there's just not enough energy coming into the earth to support dragons, so I probably won't ask this question. But all of those energy levels, you just can't support an organism that big. Say dragons eat elephants. There just aren't enough elephants to support a population of dragons, for a given area. So they're just not possible. Something that large cannot get enough energy from its food. There's not that much. The density of energy per organism is not great enough to support dragons. To describe a positive and negative feedback loop. You're going to have to read the book on that, but think of an air conditioning system. It has both a positive and negative feedback loop. It has a negative feedback loop, I'm sorry. Positive is a little bit more hard to find, but it's when you get something started, it grows, and keeps going. Negative, however, is your normal, like your AC. It keeps things in balance for a negative feedback loop. So go investigate those feedback loops. You'll have to read to learn about diversity and adaptation in 1.2. You should watch the videos and the book for the answer to number 2 here. Natural selection and evolution. Natural selection occurs in a very short period of time. Evolution is over millions of years is essentially the answer. I expect a little bit more detailed answer there, but you can think of it as short run, we can observe this. Evolution, we can't observe it. We can only infer it because it takes millions of years to see it. And the tree of life, what does it imply? Well, the simple answer is it implies we're all related, but you will have to go find more information to write an entire essay or something on this one. So the simple answer is it implies that every living thing is related. Let's see. Now, what can scientists do that others don't? We do primarily experiments. You need to read in the book on inductive and deductive. This is the first page here. Let's go on to the next. I've got to get the view here. And do that. So we can go to page 2. You need to know what a hypothesis and a null hypothesis are. You can look them up on the internet, the book, whatever. Reading in the book, you need to read this research. Know what the difference is between a variable and a control. Dependent and independent variables. All of these can be found in the book, or just a general, Wikipedia search can help you with a lot of these if the book is not very good at explaining it. And in my videos, I give you what is the difference between science and technology. You'll need to investigate that and talk about it. I'm probably not going to ask this question, but because we didn't talk about quarks. Quarks are smaller than atoms. Atoms are smaller than molecules, and they each make up one another. Um, and of course, which one is most closely assorted with an element? That would be the atom. But I'm probably not going to ask that question, but you should know that. Um, Now, you may not know this one. You could look it up on the internet, but that is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And it comes out to be chomps, where the, not an N, not chomps, the M changes to N. So chomps, and that's carbon, that makes a little word. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, all right, phosphorus and sulfur are the four most common elements associated with life. The majority of your body is made out of those elements. Let's see. You should be able to do that. You should have learned that in the 6th grade, I hope. Maybe 5th grade. But you should know the difference between an electron, a neutron, and a proton, and how they make up an atom. If you add energy to an atom, what happens to the electron? The electron spins faster. Okay, it spins around the outside of the atom faster. Be able to distinguish between covalent and hydrogen bonds. That should be in the book, a little bit in the videos, internet if you have to go there. What does it mean to be polar and nonpolar? This is all over the place, but essentially something that is polar means that you can tell one end of it from another in some fashion. It could be the shape, it could be the charge, it could be the color, but if you can say something is different on different sides or ends, especially just polar usually means two ends, so left and right. If you can tell the difference between the two sides, two ends, then it's polar. Nonpolar means you can't tell the difference. And of course, in what we're doing, we're talking mainly chemistry, so that usually means shape or electrical charge. Think in terms of the lipids or in water. That's where we use the term polar when we're talking about water and we're talking about lipids. So make sure you investigate the term polar. Molecular shape allows for drugs to exist because they can fit in place of the existing proteins. Proteins stick together, and if you can make something artificial that can like attach to something and keep another protein from attaching to another one, and instead that chemical attaches, you have a drug, more or less. There's a little bit in the videos on this. This would not be a question I would ask directly. It might have to do with, say, I gave 2 new videos earlier today, and in that, one of those was about insulin and diabetes. This might relate to those. The connection between light and photosynthesis. Essentially, light is absorbed in the form of energy coming to a plant, and a plant is going to take that light energy and add it to the electrons. So it said, what happens when you add energy to an atom? What happens to the electron? Well, in this case, what the plant does is it takes that light energy and it adds it to an electron. So what does that electron do? It spins faster around the outside of the atom. I want you to know that because that energy then can be used elsewhere. Actually, the electrons actually vibrate more. They spin faster around the atom, all right, but they also vibrate back and forth, kind of like they shake. And when you add more energy, they also not only spin faster, but they shake more, and that's important because that energy can be used other places by the plant. And we are not gotten to that point yet, but I will explain that. I want you to know that fact. What does the term equilibrium mean? It's in terms of chemical equilibrium, but you in general need to know what the term equilibrium mean. If you're in medicine or something, that will be a common term used everywhere. You take anatomy and physiology, they'll talk about equilibrium quite a bit, or at least I do. Page 3, I put some links on why water is sticky. It's also in the book, and I believe in another video. The property is hydrogen bonding, or partial positive and partial negative charges. So if you are not familiar with that, you need to probably go look up why water is sticky to itself and find out what the other emergent properties of water are. We talked about emergent properties. There are some links. I put some new links up for that. How is water related to life? You also need to go and find out the difference between hydrophobic, hydrophilic, and amphipathic. That is pronounced amphipathic. And you need to know what those three terms mean, all right, and how they're related to lipids. You'll find that they are related to lipids. Molarity, I'm not going to answer this question. It's a chemistry question, but I'm not going to ask number 6. I also did not get into POH and pH, so I won't be asking number 1, though I may cover that again later, or buffers. So these two I will not put on the test, but they will probably come into play at a later point in the class. Now carbon, I am definitely going to ask you a question on carbon, so I put some new videos out on carbon. You need to know why carbon is a special chemical and probably is required for life. It makes 4 covalent bonds, and that means it can do a lot more chemistry than other atoms. So a carbon atom can connect. It's like a Lego with more pegs on it. So if you had a Lego and it only has the little pegs on one side, you can only stick something to it on that one side. But what if it had pegs on all sides? Well, you could stick things all over it. So if you had like a square with pegs on all sides, that would be something you could stick a lot of things to in a Lego. Well, the idea here is most atoms can't make 4 covalent bonds, but carbon is special because it can, so you can really build some complex structures with carbon. You'll need to look up what a functional group is. I will absolutely ask you questions on ATP, and I want you to investigate ATP. The one phrase that you need to keep in your mind when regarding to ATP is that what gasoline is to a car, ATP is to your cell. All right, it's the power source, it's the fuel, and you have to use glucose to make it, and only glucose. What it does is it powers your proteins, plus some other things. But your proteins need to change shape, do some work, some chemical work or physical work, then they will need ATP to do that. So keep in mind that ATP is extraordinarily important. Absolutely, there will be a question on the test having to do with ATP. 4 molecules of life, that's in the book, that's in the lecture, that's everywhere, so I'm going to go on. You can look these things up. They're in the book. I briefly mentioned them in one of the videos, but just realize these are what? These are carbohydrates. These are things that you might use. Different organisms would create these or use these for different things. Energy storage. Chitin is for the shell of something like a mollusk or something. List 4 common substances made of lipids. I'll leave that for you to go find. Describe the structure of a phospholipid. That is everywhere. What is the lipid bilayer? That's also in several places. And just understand, I like this question. How does structure lead to function? So the structure of a lipid, for instance, how is its structure? It's polar. All right, that's a structure. Leads to its function, so just keep that in mind. That's where I'm coming from on that angle. Proteins also, structure, function. 8 functions of proteins, that's in the book, I believe. Proteins are made out of amino acids. Let's see, polypeptide. Proteins need to fold. They need to have a 3-dimensional shape. And polypeptides are before they make that 3-dimensional shape. So you have a series of amino acids that have been bonded together. So amino acids are a chemical. You take those different amino acids and you bond them together like a chain, but that chain can be bent and it's kind of curled up into what we call a protein when we say the polypeptide folded, and it folded into a protein. Now describe the 4 levels. I'm going to leave that to you to find. Sickle cell anemia, I did a video today on that, so please go back and watch the sickle cell anemia. Um, denaturation, all right, sorry, is caused when you heat up a protein or something else changes in a protein and it changes its shape. It comes out of its normal shape for its function. You've denatured the proteins, or you've caused proteins that are stuck together to not stick together. Usually we think of this as happening when you heat up something and the proteins stop working. You denature it. They might break apart the protein complexes. When proteins stick to one another to do something as a unit, we call that a complex. And when those complexes fall apart, you might consider that one of the results of denaturization. But generally, we just think when they stop folding up correctly. What are the difference between DNA and RNA? I've discussed that. That should be very clear. Why is the DNA in the eukaryotic special? So what does that nucleus do for it? All right, the nucleus does what for the DNA in the thing? And I covered that. I haven't covered an alignment and a consensus. You'll need to read the book for those. And I'll just leave that at that. Just make sure you do look at that in the book. What are organelles? I did not give you any specifics really about which ones we need to know about, and we will do that moving forward. But you do need to know what organelles are. In a video, I talk about the differences between prokaryotes, archaea, and eukaryotes. You need to be able to tell me that. Know what extremophiles are. They're related to archaea. Make sure you watch the video. Do not judge a book by its cover, and know that hippo whale and bacteria archaea related to these stories. Make sure you have those videos well versed. Watch those videos over and over. Also, the apartment mansion story. All right, and how do eukaryotes produce multiple cell types if they have the same set of genes? Every cell has all the genes for making you. They just don't use all that information. You have inside every cell the knowledge to be a skin cell or a liver cell, etc. But you only turn on those genes, you only use the information in the cell, in the DNA, to be a skin cell. And that's only part of the information located in the DNA. But all of that information is there, it's just not used. And we will talk at length as to how this occurs. There is something called a stem cell, which is a cell that hasn't decided what kind of cell it wants to be. So it doesn't have it's not using all the information that it could to be existing. It's just kind of resting there, waiting to figure out what kind of cell it wants to be. So it doesn't have as many genes turned on. It's just kind of sitting there. And you have lots of these, and the younger you are, the more of these you have. And depending on what happens to you in life, these stem cells can decide to suddenly become a liver cell or a skin cell. And usually this happens when you get injured. These cells are just kind of waiting there as an emergency reserve, and they will help you heal. And so as you get older, you heal not quite as well because you're kind of running out of stem cells. So children heal very quickly, sometimes without scars, because they have stem cells and they have a lot of them. All right, and that should do it. Make sure that you go back and review these things I've talked about here. I will give you a whole lecture on the structure of the test, how it's going to be structured, and how you're going to answer the questions and turn it in. But for now, I know you guys are probably wanting to study, so I want you to use this as a study guide. Use this video and this page, or this review. So good luck, and if you have questions, email me and we can Zoom.